Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Millennials with Matt. We're happy to bring this to you, give you a little bit of tips and tactics when dealing with millennial workers and as managers too. So hopefully you've taken some of these videos that we've produced and put them to good use. Today we want to talk about generations. How do we define a generation? So often generations, we think about the two bookends of a time period, maybe 1977 to 2001, something like that, when we talk about a generation. That's important, but also the other thing that's important is realizing what took place during those time periods. And that's why we put timestamps on generations. So when we look at baby boomers, not only is it the timestamp that we're looking at, it's more of the fact that the JFK assassination happened, that we entered Vietnam. So those were the things that defined the baby boomers and why they are the way they are today. Gen X, you guys were the tech pioneers. You were also the latchkey kids, and so you were very unsupervised as children. And so that defines you as a generation. Likewise, with millennials, you were born into an era, Bill Clinton era, of prosperity, the wealthiest nation, the healthiest nation. You could do anything if you put your mind to it. And then 9/11 happened, the Great Recession, 2 wars, and so that's what defines you as a generation. So always when you're looking at a generation, it's not just the timestamps between the two generations, because those can get murky sometimes. It's really what happened during the formative years of your life that make you who you are. And so when we look at a large generation of people, that's what we're looking at. A couple of the key points also to think about when you're looking at a generation is we want to be careful not to stereotype a generation. When we look at a generation, we're making much more generalizations about that generation. So stereotype might be negative connotations that we put on a big mass of people, and then we make belief around those people and we act upon those beliefs, as opposed to generalizations, which we use in science, which helps us study and observe a generation or a big group of people to help us better understand why they are the way they are. So remember, stereotype we want to stay away from, generalizations pretty good. The other thing we also want to recognize as a generation, or when we look at generations, is the idea of individuality. That yes, we can paint with a broad brush stroke everybody that's a millennial, and aren't millennials this and aren't millennials that. But really what we also want to recognize is that everybody comes as an individual too. And so, yes, you are defined by the major events that took place during that generation, but you also are defined by what happened in your personal life too, or what happened in your career life, or what happened to your parents. And so often we have to be careful when we look at generations that we're not painting everybody with a broad brushstroke. So when a millennial walks through your door, don't say, well, I know they're lazy, I know they're not motivated, because you don't know that individual. A great example of that is, I'm a big fan of Frank Sinatra, and I talk about it at my talks as well. I love Frank Sinatra. You probably wouldn't have guessed that based on my age and based on me being a millennial, but I grew up in a house that played Frank Sinatra all the time. And so those are one of those things where maybe as a generation we don't like Frank Sinatra, but me as an individual, I like Frank Sinatra. The other thing we have to look at with generations is generations versus a life stage. Many of the times when we look at millennials, they're at a young professional age, and we've all been there, whether you're a baby boomer, whether you're a Gen X, you've all been in that life stage. You've all moved to a life stage of maybe owning a house or having children or getting married. And so there are life stages that happen within any person. The difference within a generation is the idea that as you go through those life stages, you're also still defined by those things that happened during your lifetime. So the Cold War, Vietnam War, the Iraq War, those will all define a different generation and define a different life stage for you. The final thing we want to look at when we talk about a generation, or when we look at generations, is the idea of shared sense making. And that's when one generation makes a certain set of beliefs about another generation. Maybe a Gen X manager might say, well, all millennials are this. And a millennial might say, well, all my bosses or all those Gen Xers are like this. And it's when that collective group gets together, like Gen X or baby boomers or the millennials, and they all get together and they make this belief about that generation, the other generations, and usually it's pretty negative. And so what we have to be careful of as another generation look at another generation, not to have those shared sense making. So hopefully that gives you a crash course on some things to understand about when we look at generations. For more information, visit my website, www.growingmillennialleadership.com. I hope you have a great day and keep on keeping on.